you, Julie. It's so wonderful to be here with all of you. Shabbat Shalom, wherever you are. As we already said, this week we're reading Parashat Re'eh, which is in the middle, I would say, of the Book of Devarim, of Deuteronomy. We're getting to the end of our Torah reading cycle, and this is a packed parasha, as most of the parshiot in Deuteronomy are. We are again in the midst of Moshe Rabbeinu's speeches to Bnei Yisrael, and an important thing to remember is that the generation to whom Moshe is speaking is not the generation who went out of Egypt. These are the descendants of that generation, the children and grandchildren of that first generation who died Bamidbar in the wilderness. This is the generation of folks who will enter the land. And so there is a lot of conversation and there's a lot of emphasis in the Book of Deuteronomy on what does it mean when you enter the land, when you settle there. We see this particularly this week in our Parashat. We're going to focus on chapter 17 of the Book of Devarim. But in order to do that, I think it's important to have a little bit of framing for what we are going through in terms of a process of, I like to use the word centralization. People might use other words. Feel free to put your thoughts into the chat, and we will, of course, have time for Q&A towards the end. In this parasha, we are reminded repeatedly, beginning really in the 12th parak, the 12th chapter of Devarim, that Hashem is going to choose a place, and that place is where the sacrifices will be brought and the worship of Hashem will happen. Unlike the Canaanites who had local shrines all over the place, and we're told explicitly that we are to remove all traces of idol worship, lest we be lured in that direction. We'll talk about that in a moment. Hashem, God, is asking us to bring the korbanot and to do worship in a centralized location. Hamakom asher yivchar. So, of course, I read that, and I'm sure all of us read that to one degree or another, or many of us read that, and we automatically insert Yerushalayim, because it's self-evident today that Hamakom asher yivchar is Yerushalayim. And that is so self-evident to us that we don't really actually think about, is that in fact what Hashem was referring to in this particular parasha? Is that what the Book of Deuteronomy in general is referring to? I think it's also important. I always try to hold multiple perspectives when I teach. So I think it's important to say that a lot of biblical scholars believe that the Book of Deuteronomy was actually later, was written later, and was written during the time of Josiah, who was a king who was very, very committed to religious reform. So the emphasis on removing idolatry, the emphasis on centralized worship, all of that is ultimately because the Israelites and the Jewish people were practicing in other ways. Were, as happens when we are influenced by cultures that surround us, we're influenced by that surrounding culture. And Josiah was very committed to shifting that paradigm. So if in fact that is the origin of the Book of Deuteronomy, which is that's a very popular scholarly consensus. I don't know if it's full consensus, but it's very prominent in biblical scholarship. If in fact that is the case from a historical perspective, then it all makes a lot of sense. If, of course, you're looking at the Torah as divinely revealed and or inspired or both, then we're thinking about what does this process mean of moving from a place where there were other shrines. We know, in fact, it talks about a lot in Shmuel, which is why I think this is so interesting. In the books of Shmuel, we know for a fact that Shiloh was a location in which there was some kind of mikdash or mishkan, and we know that that mishkan or mikdash was destroyed. So we have a history of different locations for these kinds of worship. But now we are being reminded again and again that in fact there is going to be a place, the place, Hamakom asher yivchar Hashem, the place that God will choose. This notion of there will be a time when there will be a place when you get into the land. I have chosen this particular place, which we come to know as Yerushalayim. David, of course, desires for the Beit HaMikdash to be built. Shlomo HaMelech, his son, ultimately does so. And that is, we understand, about 480 years, I learned from one of my teachers, Michael Hatton, 480 years after Yetziat Mitzrayim. I don't have a better source to back up the calendrical calculation there of it being 480 years, but that is the traditional understanding that the temple was built 480 years after the Exodus. So we've got quite a bit of time in between that, and then the Book of Deuteronomy, if you understand it traditionally to have been divinely revealed and inspired on Sinai, as with the rest of the Torah, and then the temple. So you've got quite a gap in time. And I present that as a frame because what I want us to do today is a close reading of the calendrical cycle as found in this parasha. We have two main passages in the Torah where the calendar is laid out. One of them is in Leviticus, in Parashat Emor, in Leviticus 23, and then again we have it repeated here in Devarim 17. And what I want us to focus on, and you can read it in English or in Hebrew, I'm going to suggest English if we have someone who has the text, or Julie, if you can screen share, if we can call on someone to read. I'm going to pause during this reading, but I want us to be focusing a lot on how this text understands the observance of these festivals and how that might contrast with earlier pieces in Torah. This also, some of you in some Jewish communities outside of the land of Israel, not all, but in some, second day Yom Tov is observed. If you are in a community in that case, this is something that you will have likely read on Yom Tov Sheni, on the second Yom Tov, particularly on Shmini Atzeret, because we those who observe 2 days of Yom Tov do Simchat Torah on the second day. So this is part of the first day's Torah portion, and of course that Chag is coming up in about 8 weeks or so, 8 or 9 weeks. So we're getting ready for the season, and so I'm just giving that as context for where you might have seen this before. But I would love to invite, if we have a reader who can begin with the first pasuk of chapter 17.
We do. Thank you so much, Bimaya, for volunteering. I'm also going to do a screen share, and I put the link in the chat box for those who want to open it up on a new window.
And don't worry, I am going to probably interrupt a couple of times, so just to point a few things out, but please begin with verse 1. Thank you so much.
Sure thing. You shall not sacrifice to Adonai an ox or a sheep that has any defect of a serious kind, for that is abhorrent to Adonai. If there is found among you one of the settlements that Adonai...
I am so sorry to pause you. I'm looking at the chapter that begins with Shmor et Chodesh HaAviv.
Let's see.
Oh, yes, that was my mistake. I am so sorry. I meant Tet Zayin, no,
16.
Yes, that is my mistake. I'm sorry. It should begin in Hebrew.
We'll just scroll up here.
I apologize for that error on my part.
There we go. All right. All right. Observe the month of Abib and offer a Passover sacrifice to Adonai, for it was in the month of Abib at night that Adonai freed you from Egypt. You shall slaughter the Passover sacrifice for Adonai from the flock and the herd in the place where Adonai will choose to establish the divine name. You shall not eat anything leavened with it. For 7 days thereafter you shall eat unleavened bread, bread of distress. For you departed from the land of Egypt hurriedly, so that you may remember the day of your departure from the land of Egypt as long as you live.
Thank you. I'm going to pause you right there. That's perfect. We have something, and again, I am so sorry. I apologize for pulling up the wrong chapter number. My apologies for that. We have here a couple of interesting things that might immediately jump out to a few of us. First of all, Ken, we have the reminder that we are to make the Pesach sacrifice at night. But we are to do so in the makom asher yivchar Hashem, in the place that God chooses. In the book of Exodus, where we are initially introduced to this mitzvah, we are told that every family will, with everything ready to go, all dressed, packed, ready to go to get out of Egypt by midnight, will slaughter wherever they are. So we have shifted. We still have this commemoration of Yetziat Mitzrayim, Kol Yemei Chayecha, but we're now doing it from a very specific location, which we will see more of as we continue in the chapter. This is no longer a local mitzvah. This is no longer based on a household doing this wherever they are. This is, in fact, a mitzvah that we are all obligated in, but we must do this mitzvah from a very particular spot. Okay, do you mind continuing?
Right, I'm going to pull that back up. And Maya, do you want to? Do you mind continuing to read for us? Find you there.
Oh, right. Okay, there we go, because it wouldn't let me unmute for a sec. Right? All right. So starting at 4.
Yes, correct.
For 7 days, no leaven shall be found with you in all your territory, and none of the flesh of what you slaughter on the evening of the first day shall be left until morning. You are not permitted to slaughter the Passover sacrifice in any of the settlements that Adonai is giving you, but at the place where Adonai will choose to establish the divine name, there alone shall you slaughter the Passover sacrifice in the evening at sundown, the time of day when you departed from Egypt. You shall cook and eat it at the place that Adonai will choose, and in the morning you may start back on your journey home. So this is like a pilgrimage.
Exactly. I'm going to pause you right there before, actually, no, can you read one more passage, please? One more verse.
After eating unleavened bread 6 days, you shall hold a solemn gathering for Adonai on the 7th day. You shall do no work.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We're going to pause there. We may not even get past these verses because there's so much here. But thank you so much. Again, you gave me a perfect segue, because in fact, that is exactly what's going on here. This is a pilgrimage festival. We are now being introduced to these chagim as pilgrimage festivals, and very explicitly told that you can go back home the day after the Chag, but you have to sacrifice in the place, hamakom asher yichar Hashem Elokecha, in the place that Hashem chooses. And that gets repeated, this theme gets repeated throughout this particular chapter. We see it both with Sukkot and with Shavuot. And again, the emphasis is hamakom, or bamakom asher yivchar Hashem. And again, because God blesses you in all of that you gather, but you have to bring that gathering to the place. So even though there is this emphasis on bringing the sacrifice, we're going to think about Pesach as our example, bringing sacrifice, the Pesach sacrifice in Yerushalayim specifically, we are also told in this passage that you cannot eat chametz in any of your territories, and you cannot offer the Pesach sacrifice anywhere else in any of the other parts of the land that Hashem is giving you, aside from in Yerushalayim. So we have two very distinct things happening here. And I would like to tease those out, and then we're going to go into a larger discussion of them. On the one hand, we have, again, as I've said multiple times already in our shiur today, this parsha is very emphatic that Hashem is going to choose a location. That is where all of this happens. It doesn't happen in the local shrine. It doesn't happen in Shiloh anymore. It doesn't happen in any of these other settlements. It happens in the place which now we know as Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh, and it specifically is meant to be done there as a pilgrimage for folks coming from everywhere else, both in the land of Israel and then later outside of the land of Israel before the temple was destroyed. And at the same time as all of that, no one is permitted to eat chametz. We have two very distinctive practices that kind of got melded into one chag in our day, but in fact are two. You have Chag HaPasach, which of course happens Bein HaArbaim on the 14th of Nisan at twilight, at midnight, so we're sacrificing. And then the very next day begins the 7 days of no chametz. So anyone who has had experience getting ready for Pesach, again, it's funny to be talking about Pesach because we're about to enter Rosh Chodesh Elul, but this is a reminder that our calendar is always reminding us of all of the Chagim all of the time. If you are someone who has prepared for Pesach in any particular way, you may or may not be familiar with the idea that has come down to us in contemporary Jewish practice, that on the 14th of Nisan, again, we are not, of course, offering the Pesach sacrifice any longer, we do not consume chametz after the first quarter of the morning. So there's a very particular time, I believe it's the fourth halachic hour, and after that you are not permitted to eat chametz anymore. And most people by that point, if they are observing that stricture, most people have either sold or destroyed their chametz. There's also a particular time in that day when you are mandated to have removed all of the chametz, whether it is through burning, which is something some people do, or whether it is through discarding, which is something that some people do. But in any event, there is this idea of removing the chametz. We observe today Chag HaMatzot, although of course at our Seder, as I'm sure many of us know, we have the Hillel sandwich, and we have the Hillel sandwich as a Zecher HaMikdash, as a remembrance of the temple in Yerushalayim, where we would have gone, as it says here in our parasha, to offer the Passover sacrifice. So in this particular description, we're focusing mostly on the actual sacrifice, but we are also being reminded again that we are not to eat any chametz in any of our settlements for 7 days. And on the seventh day, it is a gathering. We do not do any work on that day. So we are again being reminded of the holiday cycle. And that Pesach has these two components to it. We're then going to get a description of the counting of the Omer and the bringing the first fruits to Yerushalayim, and we will then move into Sukkot, into a few other things. But again, we are focusing now on bringing all of this to Yerushalayim, and there is that sense of centralization that we aren't just able to offer, a sacrifice anywhere we want. We actually have to do this in this very particular location, which is very interesting to think about also, given the fact that we now today, of course, do not have the Beit HaMikdash, and everything is much more localized in one's own dwelling. So I also just want to mention, I would love to move down in our chapter, so if we could do a screen share again to, I believe it's verse 16, Tet Zayin, where it starts with Shalosh Pa'amim B'Shana. This is something that gets repeated in the Musaf, in the additional service on the Chagim. But I want us to just read these last few verses of our Parashat and get a sense of what this pilgrimage was ultimately, what its aim was. So can I have another reader who can start with verse 16 and finish and go down to the end of the chapter?
Who would like to read? Anyone interested? Tanya. Okay.
Thank you.
And I'm going to share the screen now and find this verse. Ooh, go. Okay, chapter 16, verse 16, 3 times a year. Tanya? Uh-oh, did that not work? Can you unmute yourself now?
Okay, 3 times a year on the Feast of Unleavened Bread, on the Feast of Weeks, and on the Feast of Booths, all of your males shall appear before your God, Adonai, in the place that God will choose. They shall not appear before Adonai empty-handed, but each with his own gift according to the blessing that your God, Adonai, has bestowed upon you.
Thank you, Tanya, so much. So there we go. Again, we have a reminder, or we have a conclusion, I guess you could say, to this part of the chapter, that every year, 3 times a year, all of the males, we can talk about why is it that it's only men who are required to do this particular mitzvah, are meant to go aliyah haregel, are meant to go on this pilgrimage, to ascend, to literally ascend on their feet, to stand up and walk or otherwise travel to the Beit HaMikdash in Yerushalayim with their particular gift in their hand. So the gift is any number of sacrifices. The different chagim had different sacrifices associated, and particularly with Shavuot and Sukkot, both of which are harvest festivals, there is often a bringing forward of the best from that season's harvest. And the intention here, again, is to see and to be seen by Hashem in a figurative way, of course. Now, in the Mishnah, in Masechet Avot, and I'm sorry I don't have this in front of us, but I will give it to us orally, there is an idea stated that when Bnei Yisrael went to the Beit HaMikdash on Aliyah HaRegel, or Aliyah HaRegel, on pilgrimage, there was enough room for everyone comfortably to be in the temple, which is really hard to imagine, thinking of the masses of people that would come on pilgrimage. But there is this beautiful idea that, in fact, there was a space and a place for everyone. And we can ask about, is this everyone? Is this just the men? The Torah makes it clear that it's just the males, but in our world today, we can dream of an idea of everyone finding a place wherever that place is. And something that I think is really important to mention here also is Chag. We call these holidays Chagim. We think of them, we translate that in English as festival. It's not the greatest translation of the term. We also call them Moed, or appointed times. The tractate in the Talmud and in the Mishnah, Seder Moed, is called appointed times, particularly about the festivals. But Chag is really about pilgrimage. The Chagim are specifically the pilgrimage festivals of Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. And of course, Shmini Atzeret is actually its own Chag, but it kind of gets tacked on to Sukkot. It's the end of Sukkot, even if it's its own Chag. It's an interesting kind of thing there. You've got an 8th day that's technically its own Chag, but it's also kind of connected to Sukkot, but it's also not connected to Sukkot at all. So our tradition gives us a lot of really interesting minutiae to work with there. But I wanted to end with a really interesting comparative point, which when I learned it recently, I found to be very interesting, that Chag and Hajj, some of you may be familiar with the Hajj, which is the annual pilgrimage that Muslims take to Mecca. And there's an idea, it's one of the 5 pillars of Islam. And every Muslim who is able, I am obviously not an expert on Islam, but my understanding is that every Muslim who is able to is required to go at least once in their lifetime to the holy city of Mecca. And there is a very prescribed ritual, as I understand it, of course, not something that I will ever experience, but something that I understand, that there is a ritual aspect of that particular pilgrimage. And so too, when the temple stood, and once things were centralized there was a particular way of doing a pilgrimage. And something that I've been really interested in thinking about, how do we, one of the things that I want to bring out from this portion, there are a couple of things I think we can touch on. One of the things I want to touch on is we are obviously not in a situation where pilgrimage making in this way is something that we have access to. And I want to put aside the very difficult and thorny question we're not going to get into today of what does it mean to build the Bayit Shlishi, the third temple? Is that something that people want? I have lots of ambivalence myself. I think that Rabbinic Judaism is pretty fantastic. That all having been said, we're going to put all that contemporary question aside, even as it's very live and something we are faced with in lots of different ways and something that we need to grapple with. And it's, again, I cannot overemphasize, it is a very sensitive and very potentially very emotionally ridden thing. So we're putting the contemporary application aside. We are thinking about this in the context of the parasha itself and asking ourselves the question of, what does it mean to centralize worship? What does it mean to go on pilgrimage to this holy of holies, this holiest site in the world? Yerushalayim in our tradition is understood as not only Ir HaKodesh, the holiest city. We have many, many names for Yerushalayim, but also something that is known as the Axis Mundi. So what does that actually mean? It means the center of the world, the place from which everything else derives, the place where the Shekhinah is present. All of these things, Yerushalayim is central in our tradition's understanding of ourselves, of our place in the world, and of the world itself. That having been said, what does that mean? What does it mean to move into that space of centralization in a makom asher yivchar Hashem Elokecha? And second of all, what is pilgrimage? How does that actually live in our own lives? What would it mean for us to think about pilgrimage physically or spiritually? And this is where we can tie beautifully into Chodesh Elul, which we begin tonight, Bezrat Hashem. This is I've heard some folks refer to this as our bridge month. The holidays are coming, friends, faster than we like to think. We've got a month to prepare, and some of us wish we had longer than that to prepare. But this is ultimately the time of spiritual preparation, and we are beginning the cheshbon nefesh, the soul accounting that we need to do to prepare ourselves for the new year. So what does that mean to do that work? Thinking about all these festivals, bringing the best of what we have, and all of those things are things that are taken away from this part of our parasha. We didn't go through the whole parak because in the interest of time, I wanted to use Pesach as an example of what this larger conversation is getting us at, but I encourage you to look at the verses on your own. And I now want to open it up so folks can either put your questions into the chat. We've got about 15 minutes now. Put your questions into the chat, or Julie, if you would be so kind, if people raise their hands to call on folks, that would be great, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely, I don't mind.
Great, thank you.
All right, so folks can use the raise hand function, or let me know in the chat box that you have a comment or a question, or you can just put your question in the box. And we'll start with Esther. I see you have a hand. Go ahead, Esther, and unmute yourself.
Okay, I was just thinking of the last statement you made when you said cheshbon nefesh. And to me, it's like when you go to a doctor, the first thing you have to do is admit what's wrong with you. And to me, this is what the slichot presents, recognizing whatever it is that we've done wrong and hoping to correct. So to me, this is what I consider cheshbon nefesh.
I love that, Esther. That's exactly right. Thank you. That is it. That's it. I've actually heard of some people calling Elul our yearly spiritual, to bring the analogy that you're bringing with doctors, right? Just as we have an annual physical where we have to go into the doctor and let them know what's going on with us. So too, our tradition gives us this cheshbon nefesh, this annual spiritual where we have to admit and we have to own up and we have to do an accounting of what are the areas we've done really well in. This is the part of this that I'm not so great at. I always go automatically to, what are the things that I could have been doing differently? What are the things that I'm doing really well with? And what are the things that I could be thinking about differently and really making some shifting in? And exactly, that's what slichot, and that's what this entire month, some of us are going to start slichot very imminently. Different traditions have, the Sephardi world begins slichot, I believe, with Rosh Chodesh Elul, and the Ashkenazim begin slichot much later. But there is this beautiful, beautiful idea. I really, frankly, I love the idea of doing slichot all of Elul, this lovely idea of thinking about every day as this opportunity to reawaken and to awaken. And that's, again, why we sound the shofar as well.
It reminds me of the little story they say about the two sheep. One was, the wool was taken off and one had the wool on, and they had to cross the water. And the one who didn't shade off all the seams or the wool couldn't make it through the water.
Yeah,
So
I love that.
Thank you, Esther. Bimaya, go ahead.
So this is such an interesting framing for me about thinking about it being like a pilgrimage, because I didn't notice that really in my usual reading until I read it out loud today. And I thought to myself, like, how does that translate for me today? Because obviously, you know, I'm not getting on a plane going to Jerusalem, like, I mean, I wish, but how do I sort of commemorate that? How would a person go about even thinking about that outside of traveling, like to make it like a pilgrimage? Is that sort of like our work that we're doing in Elul, like our self-accounting and all that? Or is there another more tangible way without the traveling?
I love this question so much. I've been thinking about it a lot during the past 2.5 years and before that. So I will give my own answer to that, and I really would love to hear from other people as well. Like, how do you navigate this without the travel component? I mean, I wish that I could hop on a plane tomorrow too, you know, or Sunday, I should say. But, you know, in the absence of being able to do that in this moment, what are the other things that we can do to feel like we are there? So I think it really depends on the person, right? It could be having, you know, items from Yerushalayim in your home. Maybe, I mean, for example, when I davened this morning, I wore a talit that was made in Yerushalayim. There can be thinking about elevation of oneself spiritually. So how can I refine my midot? Anyone who does Musar knows about midot, about character traits or soul traits. I prefer to use the word soul traits. How do I continually elevate them? Go on a process of ascent and elevation so that I can become the best person that I am able to be. That's another way of doing it. So there's tangible in it. There are intangible and intangible. I have a colleague who has a beautiful practice of wearing a ring on his right hand about Imeshkechech Yerushalayim, the very famous line in Psalm 137 that often gets sung, if I forget you, O Yerushalayim, let my right hand forget its cunning or be cut off. Like, there are a lot of interesting translations there. In other words, like the right hand being understood as the strong hand, like, may I lose that which is most precious to me. So there's a way of having that tangible and intangible reminder. And also, I think just finding ways to connect more to others and to oneself. Part of what pilgrimage is about is coming together in community, which right now is very difficult for some still. We are in a very interesting period in our world, on our planet, where many of us are returning in person to things we hadn't done. Many of us have been doing that for quite a while. Some of us are still not able to do that because COVID is still very much present in our world. So when we think about gathering in community, what are the different ways we can do that? We can do that physically. We can also do that spiritually through technology. We ourselves, like from all over the world right now, we are creating a kahal. We are in kahal together. We are in a kehillah together. And we are all in different physical locations, but ultimately we are connected through the amazingness that is the internet. So like all of these different things we can do to be part of this larger whole. And I would love to hear, I hope that was I hope that answered the question, and I would love to hear any follow-up or if anyone has any other thoughts.
Yeah, people just love this idea of our little Friday community being just that, a virtual community, and the connections that are made through that. So thanks for pointing that out, Rabbi Tuchman. We'll go with Tanya, followed by Stu, and then Kara.
Rabbi, I had a teacher who many years ago who made us very aware that the Elul was the time of the year when the king was in the field.
Yeah.
And I just always thought that was such a beautiful thought, because God is nearer to us now this time of year than at any other time. And it also made me think about Yitzhak, who was out in the field meditating when he met his bride Rivka. And to me, that's just like a parallel with God wedding the Jewish people.
Tanya, I love that so much. And I'm so glad you brought that in, because yes, Elul Anila Dodi V'Dodi Li, right? The beautiful line from Shir HaShirim, which some people actually have the minhag of reading every Friday. So how appropriate that we're talking about this right now. Anila Dodi V'Dodi Li, this idea of I am my beloved and my beloved is mine, and the beloved being Hashem, and God is in the field. God is here, closer, as you said, to us now than at any other time of the year. It is such, it's an image, it's an idea that just really strikes me every time I think about it, and I'm so grateful to you for bringing it in. And it is this notion of Hashem really binding or marrying the Jewish people. Binding God's self or wedding oneself to the Jewish people is this beautiful idea. We get that also during Shavuot, Zman Matan Toratenu, the time of the giving of the Torah. We have a similar concept, but we get that multiple times a year. And I find personally, I love Shavuot, it's a beautiful time of year. I think Elul has really unparalleled spiritual power. So thank you, Tanya, for bringing that in. And I think we have a couple of other folks.
Yes, two more. Stu, go ahead.
So with all these lovely connections being made, I'm sorry that I wanted to bring up the piece of this Parsha that troubles me so much. And Rabbi Lauren, I think, mentioned at the very beginning that along with the pilgrimage, there's also the removal of idol worship. But I think, you know, when you're in section 12 in Deuteronomy, where it really talks about not just removal of it, but, you know, destruction of it, complete wipeout of other people's religious beliefs. And when I read it, I couldn't help thinking about what, you know, us white folks did to Native Americans when we came here. It sort of felt very troubling to me to make that connection just come into my mind reading that part of Deuteronomy. Where also talks about giving derogatory names to the specific items of idol worship. I don't know, it troubled me.
I'm so grateful, Stu, that you brought this up, and I want to make sure we get our final comment, but I am going to respond to this with a little bit of length because it's very important. So in terms of this other aspect of Parashat Re'eh, where we're talking about total destruction of other people's religious practices, there are lots of different ways to relate to this. And actually, one thing I would love to recommend to folks is to think about what does it mean to reflect on past choices and the ramifications. I think those of us in the United States, I hope, unfortunately not everyone, but a growing number of people in the United States are beginning to finally confront the reality of, Stu, as you mentioned, of the dispossession, genocide, and displacement of Indigenous peoples in the Americas, the ways in which people were inspired by their read of religious texts to do that, and the ways in which that reverberates to this day, and how do we navigate that? So one of the things that I would say in response to that, and again, this is one of those questions that I think we never, ever have a complete and satisfactory answer to. The fact that we are troubled is really important because we are wrestlers with God. We are meant to struggle with text. I believe that is one of the greatest gifts that our tradition gives us. Ours is not a tradition that is meant to make us feel nice and shiny all of the time. Ours is a tradition that asks us to really grow and to ask hard questions and to take real responsibility and to try to be better people. We ultimately cannot change the terrible and unforgivable events of the past. But what we can do is think about how to be a responsible steward of Torah. And what do I mean by responsible steward of Torah? You're absolutely right to point out, Stu, that people were inspired by religious texts to do what they did. Also later by an idea called manifest destiny, which basically was this notion, especially in the American West, what became the American West, which certainly wasn't known by that name a few hundred years ago, but what was called by the white folks the American Northwest, this notion of if I find a land, it's mine, because I have manifest destiny. That is a very troubling idea. And therefore I can do whatever I want to do. I can destroy whatever I want to destroy because it's ultimately mine, because it's mine by right, although we can question what does that mean. So I really want us to focus on what does it mean to be a responsible steward of Torah, because that is, I think, our sacred responsibility. The first thing I would say is that context and translation matter a lot. And I know that this might ring a little bit hard for folks, but I think it's really important to say a lot gets lost in translation. If a person does not know the original language of the text, a lot of the nuances are lost. And if we are reliant upon translations that were done by others, we aren't actually empowered to figure out what this text means. We're actually reliant on someone else's understanding, which I think is important because in Jewish learning, we have an idea of a dialogue with our sages. We could think of translators as part of that. So if I'm looking at a variety of translations of the text, and I noticed this even as we were going through it today, the way that we translate and the way that we understand how verses work together is going to change from translation to translation. So that's one thing. It's very easy to take a text out of its context and to use it in a completely different context. And at the same time, within its context, it's important to ask questions as well. So we as a contemporary people, and thank goodness we are in a position now where there's more Jewish learning than ever before in the world. More Jews are learning than has been true for hundreds of years. We get to really learn this text and dig into this text and figure out what is it saying, what is the historical context, who is the intended audience, and when that text gets misused and misappropriated in horrible ways, how do we then say that is unacceptable and take responsibility for reading the text responsibly? So I'm going to end there. I want to hear our last comment, and then we will close.
Okay, go ahead, Kara, and unmute yourself.
Oh, it's Carol. I was going to comment that by going to shul, we are in fact in our own way going to the temple. Because when we lost the main temple, we have it all over the world. And thank God we now have it over Zoom for those of us that cannot yet go. But then this whole conversation came up. And what's always troubled me is even in the Torah, we're told to kill everybody in Canaan as we go in. So this started with us long before. Say anybody who was alien to our group had to be destroyed. And it just makes no sense to me that a God would do that to other people.
Yeah, thank you, Karen, for bringing that up. I think it's really important for us to grapple with why is this here? It doesn't make sense to me either. Where is this coming from? Where do these ideas arise in our own selves? We can't change the words on the page, but we can struggle with them. And that, I think, is our sacred charge. There's no answer other than to say we keep struggling and we keep asking the questions and we keep saying, why? Is this who we actually are meant to be? I don't think it is. I think we are really meant to be an Or L'Chaim. But this is here in the text. This line of thinking is here in the text. And it is ours to grapple with and to really wrestle with and to say, we are going to choose a different way. We are every day going to choose a different way with how we show up and how we treat people in the world and how we treat ourselves. So we keep wrestling. We do not shy away from the tough text. I believe very strongly in confronting things because I think that's the most honest way to teach. And we figure out, what do we do with that? And so I want to be mindful of our time today. And we're going to close here. I wish we had more time. This is such a generative discussion, but I'm going to turn it back over to Julie. Thank you so much.